Are you tired of forgetting Spanish verb conjugations? What if I told you there's a faster way that actually sticks? Soy Hamid, tengo 16 años y hablo 4 idiomas. Me volví fluido en español en solo 120 horas de estudio y ahora ayudo a otros a lograr resultados similares.
Podré para mejorar mi español cuando no tengo mucho tiempo libre para estudiar español.
In this video, I'll show you a simple method to master Spanish verb conjugations without endless memorization. Learn patterns, not verbs. This is the first leverage point, and that is to not learn verbs, but learn the patterns. Because fundamentally, if you're watching this video and you're tired of forgetting verb conjugation patterns, verb conjugations are just patterns that reoccur in verbs when we conjugate them. And so if you're struggling with forgetting that, then one issue might be that you are learning the verbs themselves instead of their patterns, okay? So an example of this would be learning puedo instead of learning the pattern of the O splitting to UE, right? And so then if you just learned poder and you just learned puedo, puedes, puede, etc., in that case, you're memorizing each verb, like you're memorizing the conjugations of each verb. Rather, if you learned the pattern of the O splitting into UE, then you not only know poder for puedo, puedes, puede, etc., but you'd also know cuesta, for example. So, and basically every other stem changing verb, okay, root stem changing, it's all very confusing lingo that they use. We're just keeping it simple. The concept here is learn the patterns, not the verbs themselves. Next is that there is no fix for repetition, but rather it's about how you repeat. And so here we have 6 study sessions and 2 different cadences, okay? Repetition is required for remembering, okay? That's just the plain fact. That being said, the way you repeat matters, okay? Consistency means that you do something consistently. And consistent is just another word for same, meaning same time. Or in this case, the time between each study session is consistent. It's the same. Relatively the same, right? Whereas here, this would be considered inconsistent because the time in between each study session aren't all the same, okay? So that's what consistency is. The reason why consistency is important in repetition is because learning is just another way of adapting, okay? And the way we adapt is by telling our body, or in this case our brain, that there is something that needs to be adapted to, okay? And so for your mind to actually recognize that as an issue, it has to be something that is seen as integral, that is seen as something that will be reoccurring in the future. Because that's what adapting is. It is planning for the future. And so if you consistently study, then that tells our brain that this is something that we need to know. Whereas if you just study for a bit and then you take a long break, that break is telling your brain, oh, that thing didn't actually matter that much because we don't need it anymore, okay? This is also why cramming for tests isn't the best way to learn, right? We all know this. And so there is no fix for repetition. You still have to repeat, okay? Because humans learn by repetition. It's the way that we repeat that matters. So first, learn patterns, not verbs, because the patterns reoccur in all the verbs, and so it is more advantageous. Secondly, there's no fix for repetition, but how we repeat matters, meaning we want to repeat things consistently, not sporadically. And by the way, if you're just getting started, I highly recommend checking out the Speedy Spanish Roadmap, which is a free course I made to help you start learning Spanish with these frameworks, and it'll be the first link in the description. The next thing I want to cover is how to repeat without memorizing. Let me ask you a question. As a kid, did you memorize your own language? Like, think about that. As a kid, were you repeating verbs and nouns and adjectives on like an Anki deck, memorizing every single word? No. What were you doing? Well, you were using words, as in nouns, adjectives, and verbs and all that, in your day-to-day life. And so without knowing it, you were doing this, okay? You were consistently studying by using the verbs every single day on a consistent basis. And so then the question is, okay, well, how were we using it? And that's where we talk about how to learn Spanish without memorization, which is what I preach. Because memorization involves skills that aren't useful, meaning it's all about reading and writing. And the problem with reading and writing is that there are skills that are useless in conversations with natives, which is what the goal is. Because if we define fluency as having conversations with natives effectively, reading and writing are irrelevant. Okay, now obviously you don't want to be illiterate. You probably want to be able to text, for example. But even then, you're going to learn reading or writing passively in Spanish. And so this whole idea of having an Anki deck where you memorize things by reading and writing, it does not matter. And we didn't do this when we learned our own native language. You know what we did? We actually used it, meaning we used it in our fluency. And if fluency is conversations between natives, guess what skills were we using? Speaking and understanding. And this is simply because that is what the fluency equation is. As kids, we were practicing our verb conjugations and the verb patterns through speaking them and understanding them. Understanding in the sense of listening to other natives speak them, okay? And then understanding them. And so, because we know that that's what fluency is, that's what a conversation is, speaking multiplied by understanding is what we should be repeating on a consistent basis. Because then we're not memorizing, we're actually using. And that's the difference. Because when you use something consistently, you just naturally learn it, okay? Because it is impossible for you to not learn the word salt if every single day at the dinner table, your dad asks you to pass the salt, right? And so the difference between memorizing and using is that when we say using, all we're saying is speaking and understanding. Because in real life, that's what you do with language. Language isn't, sure, like there is the part of reading and writing in language, but if you're watching these videos, you're trying to reach conversational fluency. You're trying to speak with natives. You're not trying to write with natives, right? You're not trying to send love letters with some Spanish girl in your class, okay? You're trying to have a conversation, right? And so most people regard memorization as reading and writing and repeating that. And so to repeat without memorization is to speak and understand, and specifically on a consistent basis. So to sum up every point, firstly, learn verb patterns, not individual verbs, because it's higher leverage, because verb patterns apply to every single verb, whereas individual verbs are just relevant for that one verb, unless you learn it through patterns. Second point is that you can't escape repetition, but the way you repeat matters. And so repeating on a consistent basis is more advantageous for you remembering the patterns than in blocks of studying. Then we talked about how to repeat without memorization, which is basically to avoid reading or writing anything and just focusing on speaking and understanding, because speaking and understanding are the only skills that we use in real life in the language, and so it stops becoming memorization. In the same way, you learning your native language as a kid had no memorization involved, right? Technically, by the definition of memorization, it did, but if someone says learn with memorization, you're imagining Anki, Dex, and Quizlet. You're not imagining speaking with your dad, right? And so even though they're both technically memorization, speaking and understanding does not really fall into that category of memorization, because it simply doesn't feel like I'm memorizing if I'm just using the language, right? And the final point here is to learn high leverage verbs, okay? So leverage just means that the inputs you put in give you more output, okay? And the higher leverage you have, the more the output per input, okay? So 1 to 300 rather than 1 to 3, okay? There are some verbs in Spanish where their irregularities apply to several irregular verbs, meaning the irregularities are regularities, okay? And that just means that the irregularities occur several times in a pattern, right? The things that interrupt the pattern happen consistently with a pattern. Does that sort of make sense? So things that break the pattern have their own patterns. And this is why the first thing I went through is to learn patterns, not verbs. Because if you just look at verbs, you're going to think that you have to memorize every single one, when that's not the case. And here they are, okay? These are the most high leverage Spanish verbs to learn, and they're all irregular. Now, if you just look at this, you're going to think, wow, I have to memorize every single one of those. But that's not true, because what we're looking at here is patterns, not verbs. And so you think you have to memorize all of these. In reality, they're all in groups, and this is how they look color-coded. And if we put them into order, you really only need to learn like 4 patterns, 5 patterns, okay? And so some of them are more irregular, and others are less irregular. But this is what the guy who has to memorize every single verb has to deal with. Whereas this is what we want to deal with, because this is higher leverage, okay? The conjugations for these types of verbs, the pedir, seguir, servir, elegir, etc., have a consistent pattern. This conjugation for these types of verbs have a consistent pattern. And so funnily enough, those are the verbs that are the highest leverage, because if you can understand the conjugation pattern behind these verbs, then not only do you know these verbs, but also every single verb that is similar, which I think there's like 120, and they all have their technical names, right? These ones are called stem changing verbs, etc. The idea here is we're studying high leverage verbs and specifically their patterns, okay? If you study the pattern of a verb that isn't really used that often, it's lower leverage and it's less useful, okay? Because in conversations, you won't be using that. And you're watching this video because you want to be able to remember these conjugations in conversations. And so, learn patterns, not verbs. So, there's no fix for repetition, but the way you repeat matters. Consistently repeating things is much more beneficial than sporadically repeating things. When repeating, in order to avoid memorization but still repeat, we want to avoid reading and writing and focus purely on speaking and understanding spoken Spanish, because these are the skills used in conversations with natives, and so learning verbs for speaking and understanding are more beneficial. Finally, we want to learn high leverage verbs, meaning the verbs on screen and their patterns, not their individual verbs. We don't want to learn individual verbs, we want to learn their patterns. And that is how to master Spanish verb conjugations. And you can see this slide is taken straight from my Spanish Fundamentals course, which is in my program where I teach Spanish. And so I do practice what I preach. And so here's that free gift I was talking to you about. I hope you enjoyed and stay humble.